Welcome to the Erasing Shame podcast. My name is DJ Chuang, and I'm joined with Dr. Jessica Cho. Thank you again for coming and joining me for a conversation. In this episode, we're going to be talking about fertility issues and what it means to be a mother from a biblical, Christian, and healthy perspective. How are you doing, Jessica?
Great. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes, and we're going to talk a bit about your research as you researched and put together a whole, is it a thesis or dissertation on fertility issues?
Dissertation on fertility and adoption.
Yes, and those are huge issues because having children, being married and having children is such a prominent and valuable part of human history, going all the way back to Genesis in one sense, because God told us to be fruitful and multiply. And there's social concerns when the population doesn't reproduce to replace itself. And yet we just surpassed 8 billion people in our world's population. So we have, in some places, a sense of overpopulation and all kinds of issues that happen because we've multiplied so much, and how that might affect the Earth's resources. But in the time we have together, we're going to spend some time just to pull the curtains back a bit and talk about a thing that's hard to talk about for us as Asians and Asian Americans, and what it's like to be single, wrestling through childless, what are our options, and how does our faith give us hope through all of that. So Jessica, start us off perhaps with what motivated you to do your research, and then how that has helped you learn to step more into your faith and helping others.
I wrote my dissertation on fertility, and at that time we had been married about 5 years, and we were still childless, and we had been open to having children pretty quickly on when we got married. And the reason for that was also because ever since I got my first period at 14, I never had regular they'll call it irregular menstrual cycles. And I grew up as a competitive swimmer. I had always been in cold water and training a lot, sometimes 5-6 hours a day. And so it was very common for a lot of the other swimmers to not get their periods very often. And so, and you'll see that with a lot of people in sports. And so, we had been in 5 years of our marriage. We still were not pregnant. We were not trying to prevent, and it was weighing on me. And I really wanted to focus on the research. And I think through my own fertility journey, I think I was desiring this idea of finding identity as becoming a mom. I needed to feel more valued, or more whole, or I needed to gain some sense of what it means to be a mother, not just a wife, but to have a family. And so I think at that time, my idea was, okay, we're not going to have, it's just not in the cards for us. And so we were looking at other alternatives, and that's where the research was transitioning from fertility to adoption. And this manual was really written for me of finding more research about what it's like to adopt in the child welfare system, not private adoption, but really a domestic adoption. What type of children are we, quote unquote, getting, and what are some of the background and adverse experiences that these children are coming into our homes, and what have they experienced before. And so that was something that we just wanted to prepare for.
Yeah, very good. So let's talk through kind of the 3 or 4 major options. Start with what you just mentioned, the existing child welfare services.
Yeah.
And then there's the adoption cross-culturally and internationally,
Right.
that seems to have gotten so much media attention.
Right.
And then for those that choose to get fertility treatment, would be
Right.
another one, and then fourth would be, well, just surrendering and trusting God has a different plan to just not be parents.
Right.
Okay,
Um,
let's go through those.
yeah. So the first one is fertility issues and deciding if we want to do a domestic adoption. We chose the route of domestic adoption because the way that domestic adoption works is that um, there's no orphanages in America. It's really called group homes, and group homes are for kids who are older, maybe 12 and older, or if they have behavioral issues, even younger. But essentially, children are born and they go into a foster family or, an approved kinship family. And how that works is although they are not yours, legally, you can foster to adopt. So you are rearing them, you are taking care of them, you are a family to them until the paperwork is finalized for adoption. And usually for infants, you can expedite that from 18 months to 2 years. And the child is in your home and you're building attachments. And really, the dissertation was focusing on attachment styles and how incredibly important that is at such a young age. Um, and that is a totally different topic from international adoptions, because international adoption is where um, the adoption process takes about 2 years, and you do not get to build those bonds of attachment because the child is overseas. You can probably visit them, I want to say 2 or 3 times prior to the adoption, but once they are yours, they are yours. So once they are legally yours, you are responsible for them. Um, we have had the unfortunate situation of bringing a foster child into our home with the intent to adopt, and once they come into your home, it feels like they're yours, but they're not. And so sometimes in the child welfare system, the pain of it is that the child can be removed and given back to either their birth family or to family of kin. And it can be incredibly painful. That was one of probably the most painful experiences for me and I think my husband. But just going through that, it just completely threw a wrench in that, and it took me some time to actually recover from that. Before, I think even now, where the topic of fostering again has come up, but it was such an incredibly, you know difficult experience, having the hope that you would have this child potentially to raise, and for them to, I don't want to say be taken, because I'm glad that the child was placed back with their mother. Um, but, and I will say, and it was so painful. So
Mhm,
that was the other part of the research that I had to really kind of, you can't just know it. There's no way to describe it or prepare anyone for it. It's just, that's kind of the way that it works. And I think that's kind of the painful part in the public child welfare system, where the child is not yours until legally adopted. Yeah. The child
well,
is not ours
sorry.
ever, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, it was painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the painful part was the loss, the grief,
Oh,
all the
yes.
hopes that you had put into fostering to adopting. And
Right.
what made that happen? Was it the mom deciding to take the child back, or the state
Um,
that's deciding?
well, in this particular situation,
Mhm.
mom was incarcerated.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
dad was incarcerated.
Oh,
Uh,
my.
family members were not cleared to take the baby. And so, because of that, the child had to go into the foster system. The child was in a
Mhm,
previous placement where the foster parents could no longer take care of this child anymore. Um, the child then came to us, and by that time, mother was early released from incarceration, which is great for her. Um, but because of the lack of communication between the social worker and all of that, I literally just got a phone call one day out of the blue from a social worker saying you need to bring your child to the office. She's bring all that she has, and she's no longer going to be in your home. I mean, we had a daughter, and her clothes were still in the laundry. I mean, I just that day is so vivid. We were cooking and people were over, and it was just like a sudden halt. Like it almost
Wow.
took the wind out of me. Yeah.
So it was a shock. There was no preparation. There wasn't like
And,
legal paperwork and discussion. It just called one day and then you had to let go.
right. And the
Wow.
and the mother, I
Oh.
remember she didn't have her own car. She took the bus
Mm,
to the DCFS, Department of Child and Family Services office, where a cousin had met her there to take the baby home. They didn't have a car seat. Social worker couldn't clear the car, and now we were just
mm,
stuck. Not, the social worker could have legally just let her leave without a car seat, but she doesn't have a car, so she wouldn't have a car seat. So just all these
wow.
problems,
Mm,
but yeah,
mm,
very drastic, and
I'm so
and
sorry.
no prep space or time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So fertility issues are just so complicated. So the foster adoption thing, very complicated. International, very complicated because you're
Right.
not just dealing with domestic laws, now you're dealing with international laws,
Right.
all kinds of paperwork and fees.
Right. The fees are another thing where in
Mm,
domestic adoption, they not that they pay you, but you get like a small stipend for caring for this child that is not yours because you're fostering them. So the government essentially, without providing orphanages, they pay you a small stipend for caring for this child. Um, and then that's the difference where the government is paying you versus in international adoptions, like you are essentially hiring a social worker to do all that legwork for you. So it does require a lot more fees and cost. And so that's another thing. If you don't have the fees to go and take 6 months off or 2 weeks off or a month off even into another country to try and bond with your child, um, that's less bonding time for when the child comes into your home. And so there's just a lot of complications and rules. There's no right or wrong way. It's just what's best for you and the continuity of of your family life once this child comes into your home.
mm. Well, I just know a little bit about these matters, and I am hearing just how so much more complicated it is than I could ever imagine or think. And I suppose for me, working on the internet for my day job, that's technically very difficult when you put people in the midst of all of this. It's exponentially more difficult because you have relationships, you have mental health, you have family, you have social things, legal things, and so on and so on. Um, what what are a few things you can say about the options of international adoption and fertility treatment? And then we
Um,
definitely want to spend the rest of our time talking about just the whole biblical hope that we can have, regardless of our marriage status or parenting status.
right. I can't speak too much on the international. I mean, based on what I know, it's just it each country has its own stipulations. Some countries require you to be a certain age, certain income, certain weight, certain years of marriage. So each country has its own stipulations on what the requirements are. And um, I think for us, it was more so just the time we wanted. The most important thing for me, based on the research of my dissertation, was I wanted the most amount of bonding time as quickly as I could get it. Because we knew that those formative years of 0 to 2 are incredibly important for attachment. That I wanted that. And I wanted to be able to really foster that and nurture that. Um, because it's already starting at somewhat of a deficit, when this child is placed up for foster adoption. And so I think that was for us like one of our biggest priorities. Um, that doesn't mean that any of these options are wrong. I know that a lot of women go to seek treatment, and we did seek treatment. And we took it up to a certain point, and then we decided to take a break because it was taking such a mental toll on. It's a lot of timing, it's a lot of shots, it's a lot of timed, even timed intercourse and timed, everything is just so rigid, and your body is not relaxed. It's stress, it's stressed, constantly thinking about creating this optimal peak for your body so that you can potentially get pregnant. And I think after a few years of that too, we needed a break from that. And um so we took a break before we decided we were going to go to the last resort for us was maybe the fertility treatments and egg retrieval and all that. But we were not yet sold on whether we were going to do that for our family. And so we decided not to do that. Yeah. And I guess,
And in the province of God, the the way it's worked
yeah.
out is
And in the
just to for
province,
because not everybody has listened to all the episodes. So while we're here with you in the province, God, what's happened since?
yeah, at the end of my dissertation and at the end of my doctorate program at graduation, I found out that I was pregnant. And so, yeah. So, and not to say that it's not God's providence um, whether we got pregnant or not. It's not God's providence. God's providence is there. So, um, gosh, I'm like getting teary. But I think um, for the mothers or the the women that desire to be biological mothers, this does not mean that God's promise is not with you or for you. Um, but I think that's what makes us kind of lean into this idea of recognizing how much value do we place in this idea of motherhood. And I think that was, our son came at year 7, and I'm so grateful. But I also know that that's not everyone's story. For some, it's much shorter, and for some, it's never. And I think for me, it was just grappling with this idea of God Almighty who could just flicker and just say, create life. I felt like was withholding from me. And I also realized that um, through those years of grappling, I had to understand why I placed so much value in becoming a mother. It wasn't for God, it wasn't for his glory, it was for mine. And I think that was a real undertaking for me. And I think when I said many times that I was going to surrender and I let go and I don't care, God, like I don't need to be a mother, like it's fine. I'm done. I'm surrendering. But I think that last year, like at year 6, when we first got our foster placement, I was graduating, everything was all lined up, and then I got pregnant. I had really surrendered this idea that I'm not going to be a biological mother, but I can still do his will. And I still have purpose. And I think that was something that was really um, important for me to hold on to, because I think when women get pregnant so quickly, and that's not a bad thing, what a blessing. But I don't think we really understand I don't know if it's a privilege or the blessing or what value we walk into and what we step into when we say we are a mother. And I really had to understand what that meant for me. I felt like being a mother was the next step. I felt like being a mother should happen. I felt like that was the next step for me. And I didn't want to be so isolated from the church, I guess, or from the next phase of life. And it wasn't those things. And I really had to grapple through those things.
Well, there's so much social and even theological pressure because and human. nature that there's a very predictable, natural human narrative that after you become a fully independent adult, you get married, and after marriage is the becoming a parent and having kids.
Right.
And we just had holidays, and for those who are young married couples and don't have kids yet, the question automatically comes up, sometimes insensitively, to, hey, when are the kids coming, or are you trying even, or hey, I really like to have some grandkids, and yet it's this issue of having children, and especially in developed countries, fertility infertility rates are increasing, and certain countries even have the repopulation rate declining,
Right.
and so it's very very complicated and um, very personal and painful. So you shared a bit about your personal journey as you provide therapy and counsel others about their parenting hopes. Um, what do you draw from in terms of your studies as well as your understanding of scripture
Yeah.
to help people?
I think the a lot of times these nonprofit organizations really do seek the local church and the community at large, but they really do target the church to provide homes for the foster community because not I think we there is this missional sense of calling and wanting to do what's good and right, but um, it requires so much more. It requires knowledge. It's not just this feeling of zeal. I think much like if there are parents now or um, even for school, I would say you can't just complete school because you want to complete school. It requires work. You have to study, right? And I think that's the same for parenting, where people just kind of, not that they take it loosely, but there is almost this expectation that it will just kind of come naturally and it will fall into place. Um, and it doesn't. And I think when foster families, and the research shows that when foster families realize how difficult it is to seek adopting or fostering a child without having a child of their own, or having a child with adverse childhood experience, that's what we call ACE, then they feel like either they are not a good enough parent, or the alternative is that child is triggering so much that the child is again re-traumatized by going into another foster family or another foster home. And so what the research is showing is that you cannot just you cannot just love a child and that's it. It requires work and knowledge. And I think that's part of the reason why there's so much more training now and so many more quote unquote hoops and red tape for foster families to go through when they actually receive children from the public child welfare system. But it's not an easy feat. There's a lot of rules and regulations. There's a lot of training that's required. And I think the best part of this is really understanding your own adverse, childhood experiences. And a lot of times we don't even realize that they're that adverse. We just think it's normal and it's not. And so just being able to know yourself can really create a much more warm and inviting home for these future children that you might choose to invite or bring into. But that was the biggest takeaway for me, that it required more than just love. That in some cases, there's a book by I can't remember, but it's called More Than Love, where she loved her foster children very much, but was unable to eventually keep them. And this was her own testimonial of recognizing that it required so much more than that, and to know yourself before almost like re-traumatizing another life.
Yeah, there's a couple books with that title. It takes more than love: a Christian guide to navigating the complexity of cross-cultural adoption
Mm,
is probably a good one. And then there's another one, more than love: adoption, adopting and surviving attachment disorder children.
I think that's the one.
Okay, I'll add
Yeah.
both of those in the show notes. Uh, Both help us to learn and count the cost, as well as prepare better to care for those in the fostering and adopting world. Now, I did want to close with touching on the biblical foundations for understanding our identity in Christ and why mothering is so valuable. It goes all the way back to Genesis, yes, but sometimes that's not reality for women who are single or even married. What verses have been most helpful as you work through it yourself and also talk with others? Or maybe not verses per se, but even the stories and the conversations you've had with God that have been most helpful.
I think for me, the biggest thing that I realized and I took away from was that my understanding of God was very small because I just felt like, God, you're supposed to do it this way. Like, why is the world, why are we supposed to get married and we have all this order, and yet why is it not working for me? Like, you're supposed to make it happen for me. And yeah, I don't think up until that point I've ever felt so much bitterness and anger towards God before. Like, I have in seasons, but I think that was a very long season and a very deep valley for me. Um, and I think in that season, it was the first time that I really allowed myself to be angry at God. And, even when I'm praying, I'm like cursing, like I'm just so upset and realizing that even in my ugliness, like I know that God is in this for me, and I'm allowed to have my tantrum, and it's allowed to be ugly and messy. And um I saw God in such a bigger way. He could hold that space for me. And in some ways it's quite beautiful because as a child, as a daughter of God, I see that with my own son, or when he's younger and they're tantruming and they're upset over something so small, and we think that it's almost laughable why they are so upset, and at the same time we can hold that space for them. There's nothing that's going to separate us from them, even in their ugliness and anger. And it really paralleled so much of why God is so relational and why he talks about relationships so much in the Bible, is because he is relational. And it's not any outcome that we have. It's not how many children I produce for him that he will love me more. It's just who I am as his daughter that really brought it home for me. And I think I felt like that wasn't enough. I always felt like that wasn't enough. Like, my outcomes are falling short of my own expectations. And if it's falling short of my own expectations, it must be falling short for his expectations. And they weren't. They
Mm.
weren't. And so I think that was something that really helped me navigate that time. It was incredibly painful. It was incredibly trying. But I look back at that time and I think I felt so close. I felt so close to God. And I think my prayer life was so much better because I had nothing else to do but to pray and like
Mm.
commune and be angry with him and vent to him,
Mhm. Mhm.
and yet I didn't want to, right? I just needed him to I knew he was there to take it. And I walked into that space, but it was hard. So just to know that we are enough with or without this family, with or without our spouses, that when we were born in the womb, that we are just fearfully and wonderfully made. Like that was just something that really hit home for me, that it was not about my production or outcome or what I could do for him. It was just me as I am was enough.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. It's so powerful. And as I'm listening, there's such amazing insight when we read the Bible through the lens of women,
Mm.
and especially that kind of wrestling with God about being a mother, wishing they could be a mother, wishing they could be married. So you look at the stories of Hannah and
Sarah.
Sarah with Abraham,
Yeah.
and then Ruth looking for a provider,
Right.
redeemer, and then what Mary had to wrestle through with Elizabeth, and so on and so on. It's there, but you really have to look for it, and you really have to have a well, for women, they have a deeper understanding because they live into that as part of their faith journey. So thank you for sharing your
You.
very personal journey, very powerful. So glad you've gone through that with God and come through stronger and able to share and help others.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I went through that season, but it was hard. And I am grateful that I still have my faith, which I know that for many women, and if there are women that are struggling through that, I just want to encourage you that he's still there, he's still listening, and I hope the best. I hope that you get what you want. And if that is a child, I hope that it is a healthy one. Um, And I will say, with or without this child, I know that God is still for us. Uh, And that can't be just the answer of our joy and our happiness. It is something so much bigger and more.
Amen. Thank you. And each of us go through different kinds of hard times, but it's really valuable here to talk about what that um, difficulty looks like through the journey of desiring and becoming a mother. Uh, I've gone through other kinds of suffering, more in the mental health realm, in managing bipolar. And the words I kind of cling on to is, well, where else can I go?
Mm.
Jesus alone has the words of life. A few other things help me along, but going away from God, I have not found anything else that could help. So that keeps me going with God. And while I'm here in Texas for a couple of weeks, visiting some people, I got to meet with someone in my Zoom small group, and she shared this prayer with me. And I want to make this a closing prayer for erasing
Mm.
shame as we go into 2023. And the words are, may his joy be your strength, his sovereignty be your confidence, and his timing be your schedule. May the peace of Christ be with you both now and always. Amen. Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Check out the show notes at erasingshame.com and subscribe to our email for updates. We would love to hear from you, so please add your comments at our website or on social. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app, and you can also subscribe on YouTube or follow on Facebook. Please add a rating and review so we can reach more people with our message of health, hope, and compassion. This podcast is the digital outreach of Christian Asian mental health. Please consider partnering with us by making a tax-deductible donation at erasingshame.com, and together we can resolve the mental health crisis for every person. Thank you.